I'll be talking about specifically scheduling considerations in the US asylum system. This work has been led by my PhD student, Wentao Wang, and it is also joined with David Hausman, who is a professor at UC Berkeley Law School. The motivation of this work is twofold. On the one hand, there seems to be, based on these headlines, a lot of people that believe that the US asylum system is in some way broken or needs fixing. And a lot of this relates to issues that for an operations management person or a scheduling optimization person relate to issues with the asylum system as a service system, meaning there are jobs that are coming in, applications, they need to be processed, and this is not happening in a fast and efficient manner. Now, the people that usually study service systems don't seem to study the asylum system very much. This is just different search terms and the number of results that you get when you look at Inform's Pubs Online, that is like the online library of the Operations, Research, and Management Sciences main journals. And you can see that there's a lot of studies on hospitals because a lot of people in our fields study scheduling in hospitals. There's a lot of research on mobility because a lot of people study transportation and bus schedules. And there's a lot of results that study any kind of scheduling problem. But there are barely any papers that even include the word asylum. Now, before I get to our own work, let me just start by highlighting what is asylum, because not everybody may know. In the US, asylum is one of two primary humanitarian immigration benefits. The other one is that of the status of a refugee. So in order to become a refugee, people have to be, one, outside of the United States. Two, they need to demonstrate that they were persecuted due to one of several protected categories. And finally, they need to not already be firmly resettled in another country. Now, in order to receive asylum, one needs to meet the definition of a refugee, except for one needs to already be physically in the United States. There are two pathways to asylum. Gets a little bit wonky here. One is affirmative asylum. This gets adjudicated through an interview with an asylum officer at USCIS, and this is for people that don't currently have deportation proceedings against them. And the other is defensive asylum, which gets adjudicated in immigration court, and it is for people that already have deportation proceedings against them. Both of these settings actually have quite interesting scheduling components to them, and we've done some work on these. My focus will really be on the first one, the affirmative asylum setting. I will try to give you a little bit of background on the affirmative asylum adjudication. I'll try to show you some idiosyncrasies of this setting and how scheduling affirmative asylum cases is really quite different from scheduling surgeries in a hospital. I'll try to describe a mathematical model of the affirmative asylum system, and this is going to be more on the conceptual side, to be clear. And then I will highlight the effect of different scheduling policies and their efficiency properties, highlight fairness considerations in the scheduling, and show you how some of this plays out historically on actual data. So, how do affirmative asylum cases get adjudicated? It begins with an asylum seeker submitting a form I-589 and their biometrics, and then USCIS scheduling an interview. This little arrow here could take weeks, or it could take years. That is the big scheduling question. Then there's an asylum officer that needs to prepare for the interview. That includes reading the application, learning more about the country of origin of the asylum applicant, doing background checks, preparing interview questions. Then is the actual interview, and that is supposed to check for credibility and eligibility. and make sure that there aren't any other bars to asylum. I won't go into the details of these, but there are various that exist and could preclude somebody from being granted asylum. Based on the interview, there's some written assessment that gets checked by a supervisor, and then asylum is either granted, the case is referred to immigration court, or it's denied. Now, there are various operational goals of the asylum system. I want to focus on the ones that are most operational in nature, that are most closely related to the scheduling, which are timely processing and efficient use of resources. What are resources? It's the time of the asylum officers. Now, timely processing. If you look over the last 15 years at the backlog of affirmative asylum cases, it's gone from a few thousand to more than 1 million. That means that a lot of cases clearly are not being processed in a timely manner. Now, it also means, from an operational perspective, that we have a service system that is overloaded, meaning that the arrival rate, the number of applications that are being filed, is much larger than what we would call the service rate, the number of cases that are being adjudicated. In operations, we usually think of various solutions to such an overloaded service system. One can try to increase capacity. One can try to reduce demand, for example, by increasing the cost of an application. For various political reasons and practical reasons, that seems to be complicated, or that is complicated in this application. But there's another aspect that is different about this application. And that is that applicants actually receive a work permit while they wait for the interview. They don't receive it immediately. About 6 months after applying, one can receive a work permit. What does that imply? It implies that for some applicants, or some potential applicants, there might be a benefit for having a longer wait. Why would that be the case? Because if one believes that one won't necessarily be granted asylum, then having a longer wait would mean that one would be able to work legally for longer. And that means that the idea that we would want a short backlog and short wait times is actually not shared by all potential system participants. This may sound like a crazy notion, but Jadu, who was director of USCIS during the last administration, actually highlighted that this was found to be the case. Some individuals realized that due to processing delays, they could file non-meritorious asylum applications and receive employment authorization before their cases were reviewed. So at least it was being suspected that this was happening. Now I want to highlight sort of how this changes the dynamics of a service system. Traditionally, when we think about a service system, for example, this box here could be a Starbucks store, we will have people that arrive and they will decide whether or not to join based on the difference between the benefit from the service, if it's a Starbucks that would be drinking a latte, and the cost from waiting in line. So we have some people that don't want to wait. If there's a long queue, that means there's a long wait. If there's a long wait, some of these people will leave and the queue gets shorter. That is how we think about service systems. Now, what if there's utility from waiting? Well, if we have a somewhat long queue with a long wait, then we're going to have more arrivals, leading to an even longer queue. And if we have a short queue with short waits, then we're going to have even fewer arrivals and an even shorter queue. So not only do we have here an overloaded service system, and of course, I want to highlight, this is very, very stylized. But it's an overloaded service system where traditional approaches to optimize scheduling don't apply, because traditional approaches don't model people that are seeking to wait. They model people that are avoiding wait, which, to be fair, is what happens in most other settings that we can think of, from Starbucks to hospitals to anywhere else. Now, we're trying to model this in the following way. We'll have an iterative model that evolves over periods. in every period, the scheduling policy, together with the rate of incoming applications, will determine how long people wait. This could be a fixed number, or it could be a distribution over different numbers. But then in the next period, the previous wait determines the rate of incoming applications. And we will be interested in the equilibrium of this, meaning the limiting behavior. As we keep updating this, how many applicants, how many wait-seeking applicants do we, or wait-driven applicants do we observe? And in particular, what we would like to answer is, how is this affected by scheduling policies, and how does the initial rate of incoming arrivals affect the outcome? Now, there's an informal theorem statement here written, but really what we're trying to get at, to summarize it, is that there are two possible outcomes under both a FIFO and a LIFO scheduling policy. FIFO is what you think of at Starbucks. People get served in the order in which they come in. LIFO would mean that people get served in reverse order. The person that got in last gets served next. This is illustrated somewhat in these plots. And you can see that for FIFO, there's a point where FIFO converges to a congested equilibrium, while LIFO converges to still the no-wait equilibrium. And on the plot all the way over here, you can see that both converge to congested equilibria, but the LIFO one is actually smaller. In our model, at least, this is not a coincidence. In fact, we can prove that across all scheduling policies, LIFO would minimize the arrival rate and the queue length, whereas FIFO would maximize it. Now, should USCIS schedule arrivals in a LIFO manner, meaning should the most recent applications be processed first? I mean, most people would say, no, that's a very weird suggestion, but that is actually what's been happening. So for most of the last 30 years, that has been the scheduling policy. There's a letter signed by more than 60 representatives of the US House from 4 years ago, highlighting that this causes significant harm. In particular, older meritorious cases have languished for years. As a result, individuals who have experienced significant trauma are left in limbo, often separated from their families while their applications are pending. Why does that happen? Well, under LIFO, if you're in an overloaded system, if you don't get processed, you're stuck in the backlog forever. So we now have people that have entered the backlog 10 years ago, and if we continue to process by LIFO, there will always be other people that get prioritized before them. How does USCIS react to that? LIFO is a critical tool in controlling non-meritorious or fraudulent applications filed only to obtain employment authorization. Going by our theoretical results, that is a reasonable response. But then they also say that they actually haven't been using LIFO. Rather, they allocate some resources to the completion of the oldest cases and some resources to the completion of the newest cases. So in a sense, they are doing a hybrid of LIFO and FIFO. They split their capacity between oldest and newest, which begs the question if that is the right way to interpolate between the two. We can again look at our theoretical model, and we would like to measure the fairness of such a hybrid policy. And the way we want to measure fairness, and this is to some extent subjective, this is how usually people think about fairness in a queuing system, is how often does somebody waiting in line experience that somebody who joined after them gets served before them. It's a reasonable fairness definition. I'm not going to claim that it's the only one. If you go with this fairness definition, something weird happens. This hybrid scheduling policy that's trying to interpolate between FIFO and LIFO can actually be worse than just LIFO. Meaning, in this direction, things become more unfair. in this direction, the backlog grows larger. As we said before, FIFO maximizes the backlog, LIFO minimizes the backlog. But in terms of unfairness, we can actually be strictly worse than we would be if we had just used LIFO. Now, let me just wrap up by showing you a few plots that are based on data in New York. On this plot, I'm just showing you the quarterly number of decisions and filings for affirmative asylum cases in the New York office. To the left, the LIFO policy was in place. Over here, the LIFO policy was in place. In between, the FIFO policy was in place, in between those red bars. Now, as you can imagine, in between, when we had a lot more applications than we had decisions, the backlog grew significantly. But what I'm showing here, and that is the blue line, but what I'm showing you here also is the black line, which shows you the unfairness. And there, I think there's an interesting insight here, which is that when the backlog is small, it doesn't matter so much whether you schedule in LIFO or FIFO ordering, because you're not skipping that many people in line because there aren't that many people in line. When this backlog grows large, then LIFO is very unfair. But of course, there's a question of whether the growth of the backlog here had the change of the scheduling policy to FIFO at least as a contributing factor. So I'll conclude here. There's an interesting aspect to asylum scheduling that traditional studies of service systems haven't incorporated. At the same time, there's a lot of expertise in computing and operations to design scheduling algorithms. Hopefully, this work can lead to more research that aims to actually improve the system in practice and highlights that there are significant decisions in immigration that are really operational decisions and that have really significant impacts on people's lives. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Questions for Daniel?
So one question, in the LIFO strategy, are you able to process more applications than in the other one?
No. The intuition that you should be thinking of, the capacity is the same. So that's a great question. I'm not trying to change the capacity of the two systems. However, under LIFO, there are more people that end up not joining the system because they fear not getting the work permit. And that makes them less likely to join, and that then leads to a smaller backlog.
I'm just curious if anyone has proposed a maximum wait time at which point the asylum claim would be automatically approved. It seems like that might help with the fairness problem.
Yes, I think that's a wonderful question, and here I clearly leave the extent to which my research would provide insights. I think to some extent what you're hinting at is really that the system has moved from one equilibrium where the processing rule was LIFO, but it didn't really matter much because the wait was short, to another equilibrium where it doesn't really matter what scheduling policy you use. I mean, I don't want to say it doesn't matter, but like the backlog is there now, and there needs to be a way to deal with it. At this point, I think most policymakers and most academics in fields that usually study immigration would agree that what is needed is more substantial immigration reform rather than sort of some change to the scheduling policy.
Okay, let's thank Daniel once again.